So this is always one of the highlights of the year. One of the things that we try to do with dissertations here is to encourage rabbinic students to lay the foundations for their rabbinic career, to show that they can bring together high-level academic work, Jewish textual knowledge, and something that's more applied. And this, I think, Yael has done in a fascinating way. I also say on a personal note, I've taught Yael for 3 different courses, and it's been fun and exciting and interesting, and I learned things from you, and hope to learn some more things now.
Is that good? Oh, yeah. Hello, everyone. I was told to encourage people forward, but it turns out there's one last seat for one lucky person if you should desire it. Anyone? Lilith will not smite you. I've had a discussion with her, so if you want it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our monstrous mother, especially to all the other monster mummies out there. Part of being monstrous is refusing to conform to traditional structures. So I'm not going to start at the very beginning. I'm going to start with chapter 3 of my dissertation with the last third, and there is a reason for that. Because chapter 3 contains my reflections about how to teach the texts that I've explored in my dissertation, and disturbing Jewish texts in general. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the best practices for a rabbi to create the circumstances for her congregants and students to approach the text in a way that are grounded and constructive rather than purely traumatic. So I'm going to do that first and speak sort of in a meta way about the process that I went through about creating this viva. So a viva is really different than a shiur, a study session that's more intimate. It's also different from being on a podcast, which I just recorded with a certain Rabbi Dr. Elliot Karstadt. It's really different, and so I had to think about different things. On a purely practical level, I'm very proud of this PowerPoint because while I'm experienced at making accessible source sheets, not smaller than 14-point people, sans serif font, I had never made an accessible PowerPoint before, so I've tried to follow the guidance, and I'm really curious if there are people who have visual impairments or learning disabilities, whether I've in fact achieved this goal. But more importantly, there are different boundaries that a rabbi needs to set in a given situation, and different safeguards a rabbi can implement to ensure that the teaching is generative rather than damaging. So we're going to speak in a moment a lot about monsters and what it means to be a monster. And monster comes from Latin monstrum, which means to reveal. So one of the main questions that I had in putting this together is about what do I reveal? What do I reveal about these texts? What do I reveal to you about myself? What do I invite you to reveal, whether to yourself or to others in this room? And what is my role or my obligation if you choose to reveal something to me? So that has been a huge part of putting this together. I've also thought of 4 essential pieces of communal tending that apply to this viva, but also to teaching disturbing texts in general. So you see them up here, offering a content warning, being clear about purpose, being explicit about one's relationship to the text theologies, and being clear about one's availability for pastoral support. So the content warning, I hope everyone saw it. If not, it's here. I asked Victor specifically to put it on the comms. So here it is again. Lilith's stories involve discussion of infanticide, baby loss, early childhood mortality, and sexual violence. Please take care of yourself and join us only if this feels like a healthy space for you. And I'll add, as Tali did before, that you can get up at any time and move to another space without judgment. And this is basically about highlighting any content that might be troubling to participants, but also involves saying how graphic it will be and when it will occur. So the next part, when I actually move into meeting Lilith, will open with a poetic description of her and will include mention of those things, the violent death and murder of children. It's going to get fairly tame when we go through our theoretical section, and actually that's where I decided to focus today. And then when we go to our text, it will get slightly racier with its discussion of sexual activity, not all of which will be consensual. And of course, Lilith is responsible for a lot of infanticide. But I did make an explicit choice not to go too deeply into a lot of the text because they are very, very distressing. And this is a huge audience. I don't know a lot of you, although I do know many of you. And it's not really the sort of situation in which I can provide pastoral support in the same way. But I want to just be clear that this isn't just some millennial snowflake tick boxing exercise. I think of it more as a film rating. You don't want to walk into a film that you think is a U and find out that it's 15, and you probably also want to know why it's a 15, so that is what I've done. It's an encouragement to check in with yourself, but it's also for me. Because what I found when I teach disturbing texts, because I tend to gravitate towards a lot of really disturbing texts, is that you teach them a lot and you get really used to them and you become really flippant about them and you forget that they might actually terrify people. So this is a reminder to myself to be sensitive. So what's our purpose in being here today? Actually quite important, as I learned the hard way in a session I was teaching. If you don't tell people why you're bringing these traumatic texts, then it's really, really ungrounding. And people they're like, why did you bring me this scary thing? And now I'm just, so tell people. So here are my objectives. To share some research with you. We're obviously part of this larger project of the LBC Study and Darkeinu. We are also going to be, in the dissertation, interrogating what we mean when we use the term monster. And we're going to learn a little bit about how that manifests in particular in the feminine form. I want to give us a complex reading of the character of Lilith, who is both monstrous and multifaceted, and then to explore the ways in which studying the character of Lilith can be generative, by challenging us to look inside ourselves in Jewish tradition, to engage with the parts of ourselves in our tradition that we often find too disturbing to acknowledge, and by offering us a way into compassionately holding space for the pieces of ourselves and our tradition and our world that terrify us. This one's a fast one. Be explicit about one's relationship to the text theologies. We are going to encounter lots of monstrous, terrible, misogynist, horrible theologies. I don't subscribe to them. You don't have to feel like you have to either. Please do smack back at them. Particularly when we go to Aleph Bet of Ben Sira and the Zohar. This is not progressive Jewish theology. Please challenge them. And then this availability for pastoral support I already alluded to, and I added, in what capacity? So in terms of today, given the scale of this lecture, I can't actually provide it, but I do encourage you, if you need the support, to please seek it from someone you trust. The last thing I want to do in a shiur is offer a prayerful moment. And that actually took a lot of reflection to get to this place. Because the goal of a prayerful moment is to ground people. And that's going to be different with different audiences. So when I taught this at Beit Kohenet, which is a training institute that focuses on the divine feminine and reclamation of women's rituals and earth-based theology, I started with a goddess chant. And I think while there are some people in this room who would love that, and I see one of them over there, yeah, I see some of you, that probably is not the majority. And then I thought, well, maybe we'll recite Psalm 121, because that's on a lot of Lilith amulets. And that might have been familiar to some people here, but less so. But I thought this bracha is this blessing is one that many people, probably the majority of people in this room, will be familiar with. And if the goal is grounding, familiarity is really important. I'll get you to sing goddess chants another time. So let us say together the blessing for study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So now that we put into practice the lessons of my third chapter, I invite you to join me in encountering Lilith in her guise as monstrous mother. She sits on a rock at the edge of her cave, overlooking the stormy sea. Her long, tangled hair obscures her hunched form, her head in her hands, bowed with grief, her body racked with sobs. She weeps for her children, refusing to be comforted, for they are gone. Bitterly she weeps in the night, her cheek wet with tears. She who bore 7, no, more than 7, is forlorn. Is she the matriarch Rachel? mourning for her children in exile? Is she Jerusalem, princess amongst nations, destroyed and ravaged, who can do nothing but watch as her children are raped, murdered, and taken into captivity? Is she Mother Zion, seeking desperately for someone to comfort her as the world crumbles around her, and any of her children who have survived the massacre put to sword? The sea around her is littered with uncountable corpses, the bodies of her children. She turns her face to look at you. You see the rage in her bloodshot eyes, her hungry mouth. Her teeth are sharp, and then you notice her wings. She's no Mother Rachel. She's Mother Lilith. 100 of her children die every day, and now she's coming for yours. So I should say that about this image, and many of the images you will see that they are done by a Vancouver-based artist called Lillian Broca, who did a series called the Lilith series. And there she is for you. And I also just want to speak to, I don't know if there's anyone in the room who hasn't heard of Lilith, but before we go on, she's a female demon in Jewish tradition, known for her threat to children and pregnant women, as well as her sexually predatory behavior towards men. So let's begin to meet her properly. Since even before the Hebrew Bible, Lilith has worn many faces. From her origins in ancient West Asian demonology to Adam's untamable first wife and even God's own mistress, Lilith has always been multiple. To borrow a phrase from Luce Irigaray, she is not one. She has been a murderer of children and mothers in childbirth, a seductress and rapist of men, a stealer of semen, the shadow side of the Shekhinah, the monstrous opposite of the divine feminine. For many, she is vengeance personified, wild, untamable, unquenchable rage. And yet, Lilith attracts, seduces. Her character engenders a pleasurable frisson of terror. But she also lures those who meet her down a road of untapped possibilities, outside the realm of what is normative and into the liminal realm in which we become aware that containment, whether of people or of ideas, is illusory. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Lilith has been reclaimed by various communities, a patron saint of marginalized groups. She has become a feminist, lesbian, queer, and transgender icon, and for some, even a goddess. One cannot underestimate the importance that these reclamations have had, the inspiration that she has provided to each of these communities. And yet, in the process of reclaiming Lilith, these groups have often suppressed her monstrosity. In championing Lilith as their heroine, they have stripped her of her grit, violence, and destructive potentialities. So the premise of this dissertation is that in order to be truly monstrous and truly feminist, Lilith must terrify feminists too. And we must all make space for her multiplicity. And by feminism, I mean not only a movement that advocates gender equality, but that also takes seriously the lived experience of women. And I chose to speak on a particular one of women or female-bodied lived experiences, which is the experience of motherhood. It's one of Lilith's many manifestations. She has loads going on. But I just wanted to do that, partially because it's personal, but partially because it is difficult. And I've spoken about why we need to fear her. Why do we need to fear her? Why is having monsters so important? Because fear challenges us to face the most disturbing parts of ourselves and of this world. If we are not afraid of Lilith, then we dodge the most challenging forms of self-reflection, as well as critical ethical questions about our behavior and the societal structures within which we exist. What we lose when we transform Lilith into a heroine is really, it's kind of a way of caving to the patriarchal order by smoothing out her wildness and ferocity and taming her into something nice and good and acceptable. She is not a freedom fighter. She is a terrorist, and that is her power. So if we smooth her out, we don't get the opportunity to ask, what do we do with that aspect of ourselves that longs to rip the existing world order to shreds? particularly if that world order appears to merit obliteration. How do we ensure that we ourselves do not tear the world to shreds? So I set out to offer a reading of Lilith through a lens that is feminist, not in its redemption of Lilith, but in its refusal to allow her to be flattened. And in this dissertation, I was guided in my work by monster theory in the works of Jeffrey Jerome Cohen and Margaret Shildrick, and the monstrous feminine in the work of Barbara Creed. And all of them draw on Julia Kristeva's concept of the abject, which is central to their works. And when I did that, I looked at some of our Jewish texts, which we'll get to later, but now it's theory time. So who is Julia Kristeva, and what did she say? So concisely put, the abject is what threatens the boundaries of the subject and thus threatens to return us to a state of non-subjectivity, which means in English, the abject is something that provokes a sense of disgust within us, a big ugh. Want to keep away from that, a disgust often at our own bodies. So the examples that Kristeva uses are menstrual blood, feces, semen, vomit, corpses. It is anything that reminds us that we are made of meat, that insists on our relationship to death, corporeality, animality, and materiality. And these products repel us not because of hygiene, though that's a part of it, but because they might remind us that we're porous, that our boundaries are not fixed, and that actually nothing is really neat and tidy or fixed. And it's not even just about these bodily products. It can also be about an individual or groups of individuals. It's anything that draws our attention to the fact that the boundaries are fluid. And actually, we might think that things are quite contained, but they can't be. And so we'll see how this leads us. It's already pretty obvious how it's going to lead us to the monster. So, even in repelling us, it's also very seductive, which again leads us to the monster. So we're going to start by meeting Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, who wrote Monster Culture 7 Theses. So I will take us briefly through all his theses. And this is his definition of what makes a monster. So number 1, the monster's body is a cultural body, which means that the monster reveals anxieties particular to our time and place. Number 2, the monster always escapes, which means even when sort of we stop talking about the monster, it'll always come back, but it'll look a little different. Number 3, one of my favorites, the monster is a harbinger of category crisis, which means it terrifies us because it transgresses boundaries and can't be pinned down to a particular identity. Number 4, the monster dwells at the gates of difference. The monster functions as dialectical other, so it's typically a way of demonizing difference for reasons that are cultural, political, racial, economic, and sexual. And this demonization offers justification for the monster's obliteration. Number 5, another favorite, the monster polices the borders of the possible. So it's a way of reinforcing society's boundaries. So you either get something like a map that says, here be dragons, and you know you're not supposed to go there. Or you get someone to say, well, don't go hang out with the vampires because they'll turn you, right? So it's a way of saying, don't do that. But fear of the monster is really a kind of desire. What is more desirable than that which we should not have? And then number 7, the monster stands at the threshold of becoming. Monsters are our children. That is what he says. We are the ones who gave birth to them. And as monsters, they have something very important to reveal to us, monstrum as reveal. And this revelation comes in the form of question. Like Frankenstein's monster, they ask us why we have created them, and we are forced to reflect on the answer. And so there's our Lilith as a harbinger of category crisis. Is she woman, goddess, human, bird? I don't know what's going on there, and neither do we, and that's unsettling. And where, in fact, is the separation between demonic and divine? Because actually that on the side, on the third one over that way, she looks like the goddess Inanna, who precedes our tradition. So now let's meet Barbara Creed. I was asked a very insightful question by Rabbi Professor Deborah Kahn-Harris during my last presentation, which is about, so what's different when the monster is in feminine form, but also what's different when the monster is created by women or created by feminists? And so Barbara Creed is mostly analyzing horror film, but I think that what she has to say is transferable to other media, including our texts. And she uses the word monstrous feminine to illustrate that the female monster is not just the girl version of the boy monster. She's horrifying in ways that are particular to her gender. And she says, when a woman is represented as monstrous, it is almost always in relation to her mothering and reproductive functions. And she assures us that nothing is inherently abject about those things, that they are a construct of patriarchal ideology. And that is very much a Lilith thing. She is going after babies. It's about sexuality. It's about reproduction. And she is a construct of patriarchal ideology. And like other female monsters, think of Medusa, think of mermaids, think of the sirens. She troubles the human, non-human binary. So we see that she has wings, and here she actually is part serpent. So there are bits of the text that I studied where she is identified with the serpent. So she's not quite one or the other, which is part of the premise of the dissertation. And another thing she brings in is the concept of radical abjection, which is particular to the monstrous feminine. It's when the monster becomes conscious of her own abjection, the ways in which she's been from society, and she weaponizes it against the structures that objected her. And what's interesting about that is for those who identify with the monster, she might not actually terrify them. So this, I can thank Rabbi Martina, who may or may not be in this room, for introducing me to Hothead Paisan Homicidal Lesbian Terrorist, which is a comic from the 90s when I think homophobia looked really different than it does now. It's not gone, but it was a really, really different situation. And it's about a lesbian who's so angry about heteropatriarchy that she goes around killing sexist, misogynist, homophobes, and just like shoots them all up. And that's kind of the comedy of the comic. And it's basically a cathartic fantasy. And this comic strip is from a sort of meta moment where there's this character on the right who's written in to say, you know, how can you have created this character? Like, she's giving a bad name to women. There's more productive ways of sort of moving forward our cause. We should be writing letters. And then the response is, look, we're dealing with a fantasy here. Haven't you ever been so pissed off at someone that you fantasized about killing them? Maybe even possibly your Uncle George? And then what this character does is she ends up subscribing. And so there is something in radical objection that is about that cathartic fantasy for the people who identify with the monster. So the last theorist I'm going to go to is Margaret Shildrick. And basically, we've been talking about monster as external construction, but she also talks about the way that the monster emerges out of our internal experience. And the monster troubles us not because they are not us, but because they are us. So monsters aren't just about cultural fears, but they're also the products of our fears about ourselves. The monster entices us because, at least in part, the monster is us. We cannot finally locate the monster as wholly other. If each of us has elements of the monstrous within us, then how do we treat the monster? And some of you guys realized what that was. Some of you did not. This is a still from K-pop Demon Hunters, which was the soundtrack to my dissertation. Clive remembers having dance parties with me in the Blue Room to K-pop Demon Hunters. But for those of you not in the, on the right with the purple hair, that is Rumi. She is a demon hunter who is part demon. And on the left, we have Jinu, who is a demon who is starting to rediscover his humanity. And so I think that's a beautiful image of this idea of embodying the monster and kind of sort of monster of vulnerable self, because it's about relationship. It's about entering relationship with the monster. It's about acknowledging that we have monster. It's acknowledging that something more might be going on for that monster. And because the monster exposes the porousness between self and other, monster and not monster, we then become engaged in what she calls an irreducibly ethical project. We are at minimum forced to empathize with and to accept the monster with limitations. We may even be obligated to give the monster a place in our world. So I had a few challenges to our theorists. I mostly agreed with them in terms of the idea of construction of the monster, in terms of it being about ourselves, not just about what's out there. But here's the thing. I love radical objection, and I think it is very cathartic, but the monster really should terrify all of us. Lack of fear reflects a lack of empathy and self-awareness. If we're just like, oh, let's go kill all the people without thinking about that, then that can have really, really difficult implications. And ceding power, no matter how willing we are to do so, remains terrifying. There's no revolution that has ever happened that has not been bloodless, and that comes with its implications. And those are the ethical questions. Are we going to engage with those parts of ourselves? Is it worth it? Or are we going to shut them down? And I see a revolutionary in the back who's nodding. So there are questions that come out of that. How much do we do in order to create something new? And how daunting is that? And whatever horrors we engage in to create that something new, how will that change us? How will that impact us? And specifically, I wanted to think about why Lilith should terrify feminists in particular, because she does those things. She captures our anxieties about a post-patriarchal future, what it might hold for us, what responsibilities we might have in establishing it, and the process by which it might be established. What are we going to have to do in order for that to properly happen? She allows us to engage with the prospect of explosive power and our own capacity to destroy. And if women cannot be truly monstrous, have we truly achieved equality? I remember vividly a lesson that I taught about the divine feminine in Jewish tradition. And there was someone who said, well, God can't be a woman because a woman would never have done such a horrible thing as tell Abraham to sacrifice his son. I think there are plenty of women who would have done such horrible things. And if we try and smooth that over and just say we're all angels in the house, then we've missed something about the humanity of women. So why focus on her motherhood in particular? I think because it's harder, right? When we focus on reclaiming her for her sexual appetite, like we can just say, okay, we're being sex positive, and being sex positive is great, and well done, sex positivity. Her murderousness, specifically murderousness of children, is much more difficult to square. Like, how are you going to reclaim that and make it nice? And it makes her not a heroine, but I don't think she needs to be a heroine. We need to be able to create monsters on our own terms. We need to be able to peel away the ways in which patriarchy has constructed monsters and projected them onto female monsters. And we need to make a monster constructed by us out of our own fears and anxieties. May or may not get the reference, but this is Moana. And spoiler alert, they're both the same. Okay? So we're going to begin to meet Lilith, the monstrous mother, and what she reveals to us. So she's a monstrum, what is she revealing? So I think that there is something that is really obvious, which is even with monstrous medicine, the specter of infant and childhood mortality does still stalk us. But this fear is even more real when each of us recognizes that Lilith is not only an external threat, but an internal one. The desire to harm or murder children, even one's own, is not uncommon. Most of us do not act on this urge, but that does not change the fact that some people do. And to be fully human, a woman must be able to acknowledge her own multiplicity. She must not be confined to her role as creatrix, but must also acknowledge the pieces of her that are the destroyer. And so my reading of Lilith is an example of how feminists may define villainy on our own terms, peeling away those patriarchal assumptions and subsequent patriarchal readings of those texts, and re-examining them, and allowing us to meet her as monster in all her complexity. So we're going to look at 4 texts today that explore Lilith's association with children, both as child murderer, but also, surprisingly, as a character who exhibits care and longing for her own children, which I think is the thrust of the dissertation, right? She's not one thing or the other, and why it's so fascinating. So I'm going to begin with the Aleph-Bet of Ben Sira, which you can't not. It's a satirical text from the 8th to 10th centuries. And the reason why I have to do that is because it's the first text to weave together the mythology of a character called Lilith with the mythology of Adam's first wife. Prior to this time, they are 2 separate entities. And then I'm going to go to 3 texts from the Zohar. I'll talk about why that's surprising later. So, the alphabet of Ben Sira. What is this text? I did find it, this thing. This is actually a real song, real YouTube video. You can go watch it if your humor is the same as mine. So what is the alphabet of Ben Sira? Norman Brosnick says the alphabet of Ben Sira may be one of the earliest literary parodies in Hebrew literature, a kind of academic burlesque, perhaps even entertainment for rabbinic scholars themselves, that included vulgarities, absurdities, and the irreverent treatment of acknowledged sancta. So to give you some sense of what else is in this book, it opens with the story of the titular Ben Sira's birth. This birth is the result of the prophet Jeremiah's daughter going to the bathhouse and being impregnated by Jeremiah's own sperm, which happened to be there because Jeremiah was coerced into mutual masturbation. And then Ben Sira comes out of the womb being able to speak, and he bests his tutor by providing an aphorism for every letter of the Hebrew alphabet. At the young age of 7, Ben Sira becomes an advisor to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and he's able to do all sorts of amazing things. And my favorite story is, in fact, the one that comes after the story of Adam and Lilith. There is a princess who cannot stop farting. She expels 1,000 farts every hour. And so Ben Sira tricks her into holding in her farts for 3 whole days, after which she stops farting. Maybe not what you would expect. So this is actually amazing to find out, because the story of Adam and Lilith, which I'd studied before, I'd always learned it in a very earnest way, and I'm not sure how earnestly we're supposed to read it. And so we really have to ask, what exactly is this story trying to do? So one is to make us laugh, given our context, and we'll see if we actually think it's funny, because I think senses of humor change over time. One of the other things it's doing is trying to explain the source of the tradition of the angels Sanoi, Sansanoi, and Semengeloth being printed on amulets to protect pregnant mothers and babies. So you can see them sort of, it's not a very clear picture, but you can see their names and shapes over there. That is a Lilith amulet. It's also trying to reconcile the 2 creation stories. So there are 2 stories of the creation of humanity in the Hebrew Bible. One is in Genesis chapter 1, where human beings are made at the same time. And there's one in chapter 2 in which man is created first and then woman subsequently. It's also trying to offer an etiology for baby loss. And I think if we're trying to look for the jokes, I think it is a satire about the relationships between men and women, because Lilith and Adam, as we will see, both fail to conform to gender norms. So, what happens? God sees that it's not good for the human to be alone. Adam just means human. And immediately they begin to fight, and the fight is about sex positions. So she says this very famous thing, she's not going to lie below because we are equal since both of us came from the earth. And that has been read by the contemporary feminist movement as a call for women's rights. But I think it was most likely originally a joke at Lilith's expense. Because how can this woman think that she's so empowered as to be on top during sex? Ridiculous. How can she think that being equal is even a possibility? That's so funny. Anyway. What does she do? Lilith says the ineffable name of God, which gives her the power to fly into the air. That might be when she gets her wings. And here's Adam's movement of transgressing gender boundaries. He says, Master of the universe, the woman that you gave to me has run away from me. He's very sad. So he's kind of going into a more feminized space. And there's problems with both of those archetypes, because obviously we want everything to be accessible to everyone of every gender. So what does God do? The Holy Blessed One sends our angel friends to bring her back. And God says that if she doesn't come back, she will have to accept that 100 of her children will die every day. But she refuses to return, and the angels threaten to drown her. And at that point, she takes up her mantle, and she gives us an explanation of why she is in the world. She says, "Leave me alone. For I was only created to weaken babies. Until 8 days after he is born, I will rule over him if he is male. And if she is female, for the day of her birth until 20 days. So 8 days, obviously, circumcision. 20 days, there might have been some kind of female initiation ritual that we don't have anymore at 20 days. But there's a sense where those rituals are supposed to protect the child. So this is the pre-protection. And the angels keep trying to take her back home. So she makes another pact with them, and she says, put your names and forms on these amulets, and if I see them, then I won't kill the baby. And she does accept upon herself that 100 of her children will die every day. And so therefore, 100 demons die every day because Lilith becomes queen of the demons, mother of all demons. And this price of freedom is very high. Those 100 children who die every day can be read as miscarriages, stillbirths, infant deaths, deaths of children at any age, and this is beyond heartbreaking. And I mean, just do the maths. I mean, we're in year 5, 7, 8, 6. This happens on day 6. So like 100 every day since day 6 is an astronomical number. And she's given this job of killing babies. So is this her revenge? Is it part of her punishment? Because she's given the task in the world that will most destroy her, someone who wanted to be a mother, someone who is going to be the mother of all life, and now she's a mother of the dead, and she's responsible for killing more children. And that's really, really heartbreaking. It's not funny for us anymore once we see that. What I was also really intrigued by was the connection to the Sea of Reeds, because I think that's where the story becomes even more universal. Why do they catch up with her at the Sea of Reeds? Why does she make her home at the Sea of Reeds after this? That's where her cave where she dwells is. And that's because it's connected to our own monstrosity and our God's monstrosity. The Song of the Sea is a rage song all about our enemies being pummeled. It shows us what we are capable of and what God is capable of. And when I taught this before, someone asked, well, wasn't what happened at the Sea of Reeds justified? How can we criticize the Israelites and their God if they were fighting back against 100 years of oppression? And I came back and said, well, that's not the point. Like, the question is more about what it would take to push us towards that grief that becomes rage and morphs into extreme violence. How do we find that boundary? Where is that boundary? What would it take for any of us to become monstrous? Because if we look closely, we can see a kind of reason in Lilith's behavior, and we can develop empathy for her and her situation. So this isn't really a question about justification. It's about reflecting on what happens when our ethical codes are pushed to the brink by our circumstances, and what happens to us when we begin to empathize with those who transgress these ethical codes. So now we're going into more unfamiliar territory. We're jumping into the Zohar. First, I probably should say what is the Zohar. It's a foundational mystical text written in the 13th century, probably by Moses de Leon, but maybe a group of authors. But he claimed it was the work of the 2nd century sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was associated with magic and mysticism, and it functions as a commentary on the Torah. The second question is, why Zohar? Because it's a surprising choice for a progressive rabbinic dissertation. I've definitely gotten some eye rolls for mentioning that I was studying the Zohar. And I think we have a general suspicion of mystical literature because of its non-rationalism, because it's esoteric, because it's elitist, because of the way it dallies with dualism and polytheism, though I think definitely mystics would push back against that last point. But it is a bonkers text. But there are reasons that I chose it. And the first one is really relevant to this dissertation because it's one of the first works to flesh out Lilith's character and complicate her. And that's because of the book's theology. Because the book views everything, including the Sitra Achra, the demonic realm, as being part of the divine plan. Everything has a role in the universe, including evil, and Lilith is part of the divine plan. So you get into this situation where, well, if it has a role and it was God who set that up, then actually Lilith is kind of good and the evil side is kind of good because God decided that's the way it should be. So then who's the real monster if God decided it should be that way? And maybe Lilith's kind of okay because she was put in this, like it just makes everything a lot more complicated. And also, even if the authors weren't necessarily concerned with her pathos, because of this theology, they give us a lot more insight into her character and motivations. And the text is also monstrous itself in the way that we were discussing with monster theory. Obviously, there's monstrous theologies, which we will encounter, but it's also, tradition has grown heads here. The text is full of monsters, and the language itself is hybrid because it's medieval Aramaic that's pretending to be 2nd century Aramaic by someone who doesn't really speak great Aramaic and is making up words. And there's a deliberate attempt to exclude anyone who is not equipped to penetrate its borders, policing the borders of the possible. If you don't have that kind of Aramaic, and if you don't have a lot of pre-existing knowledge, and if you don't have a properly annotated Zohar book, lots of volumes over there, and if you don't have a great teacher like Rabbi Mark Solomon, then you have no hope at ever understanding what is going on. And even then, you might, still hard. So unfortunately, we won't get to all these texts, but we're going to jump into them. But just remember, I'm saying my relationship to these theologies, there's some pretty terrible ones here. I just want to come out and say, I don't think baby loss and child mortality are ever the parents' fault. So please don't come away and think that I think that, or that you have to think that. So our first text is a story about Lilith, our demon mother, trying to cleave to the cheruvim, the cherubim, who are called in here the small faces. And they're kind of like babies. There's a Talmudic etymology that keruv is related to the Aramaic karavia, which means like a child. So we have this image of our bereaved mother who's lost all these children, trying to bond and cleave to the children on high. And so before we get any further, what we see is actually she's a mother longing to see herself reflected in her child's features. So that's what it means to be embroidered into them, to kind of see herself reflected in them. And she wants to cleave to them. Like it feels like maybe, she's trying to snuggle those children, those kruvim above. And we only get a sense that actually this is nefarious when the Holy Blessed One rebukes her and throws her into the depths of the sea. So maybe something not so great is happening. And then she gets her job. The Holy Blessed One takes her out of the depths of the sea and causes her to rule over children, small faces of the children of men, so we have the small faces above and below, who are fit to be punished for the sins of their fathers. So we're seeing here divine justice and Lilith as an instrument of divine justice. We had in the beginning, she was going out trying to cuddle these little babies, and now she's being sent out by God to kill more babies. So her motherhood is frustrated once again. This one is one that I felt a particular connection to. We had a question earlier about disability access. So that's something I was thinking of in putting together the presentation, but also here because it is a passage that deals with epilepsy. There's been a lot of complicated history about epilepsy being associated with the demonic, so don't take away the message that I think epilepsy is demonic. I have it. But there is a way in which this text is engaging with disability. And this is how they explain why epilepsy happens. So when a man impregnates his wife after having had an erotic dream about Na'ama, Na'ama is sort of a sister demon to Lilith. She does the same kind of thing of seducing men in the nighttime. Lilith seeks out the resulting child and bonds with him. She raises him and spends a lot of time with him, and she doesn't kill him. So she's kind of operating like an adoptive mother there. Like it's really actually sweet. Maybe she's a mother, maybe she's a babysitter, maybe she's a female relative. But when she visits them once a month, it gives that child seizures. So Lilith is nearly able in this case to fulfill her desire to become a parent and a mother, but she realizes that spending time with them is not actually good for them. And so she's faced with this impossible choice. Is she going to spend time with them when it's not good for their well-being? Or is she going to abandon them for the sake of their health? And this made me think of parents who in divorce who are denied custody or visitation rights of their kids, who want to see them anyway, or parents whose child is taken into the care system. Do those parents not want to see their children? Of course they do. And so Lilith here again, she is causing harm, but it's out of this place of love. And what do you do with that? There are many places in the Zohar where there are things that parents can supposedly do to prevent the deaths of their children. So there is, for example, a ritualized sex spell that you can utter that will make sure that your baby is okay from Lilith. But there are certainly circumstances in which that is not possible. And there are some deaths that no parent can avert. And this is the job that Lilith gets. Lilith kills babies who would otherwise grow up to be sinners. The Holy Blessed One sees that if they endure in the world, their odor will stink and they will turn sour like vinegar. He plucks them small while they still yield fragrance. What does he do? He leaves them to be tormented at the hands of this slave girl, Lilith. For as soon as one is delivered into her power, she delights over that baby, torments him, and removes him from the world while he is suckling at his mother's breast. And knowing that this is part of God's plan makes us question who the real monster is. So why study these texts if they're so traumatic? And that was really a snapshot. I could have gone much deeper, and I definitely did not. I think because studying these texts is more than an intellectual exercise when you get that dark. It's because encountering Lilith as multiple or monstrous mother can be a pathway for congregants or students to give voice to emotions and experience that they have previously considered shameful. So we've discussed maybe the grief rage of a bereaved mother, one who has repeatedly experienced baby loss, whose children die in infancy, who mourns and through mourning discovers her capacity for anger. And the conversation around baby loss has gotten much more loud and much broader recently, but still grief is really, really palatable in a woman, and anger much less so. It's really difficult to talk about. So could studying these texts allow someone to voice her anger? It could also be an opportunity for parents to discuss their conflicted experiences around parenthood itself, especially rage towards one's own children. Lilith's stories can act as catharsis for any parent who is pushed to the brink by their children. And you need to look no further than folk lullabies, which kind of also do this rock-a-bye baby, that's the baby falling down and getting smushed, people. So I think many people in this room may or may not be parents, but sort of that desire of, I'm going to kill this child, needs to go somewhere so we don't actually do it. Love you, Dahlia. Anyway, I dedicated my dissertation to my 3-and-a-bit-year-old, 4-year-old almost. Not everyone here is a parent, though, but it's still applicable beyond people who are parents because everyone has pieces of themselves that they consider abject. And so this is an invitation for anyone who studies these texts to be with the parts of themselves that terrify them and hold them with care. So studying these texts can actually lead to pastoral encounters. We talked about giving voice to one's experience, and then also this process of, well, if we develop empathy for Lilith, for this demonic character, can we also develop empathy for ourselves? But that can get really tricky. And as clergy, we need to think about what that means and what that looks like. Because we as rabbis will often be the ones to receive disturbing information about people in our communities, sometimes from the people who have been impacted by that person's actions. And we might be called upon to give pastoral support both to the monsters in our communities and their victims. And being equipped with the understanding that people are multiple, like Lilith is multiple, we saw a complication of her character, can help us fulfill our pastoral roles. Lilith teaches us that when we sit face to face with the monster, we cannot ever see them as one thing or the other. There is monster in the human and human in the monster. Meeting Lilith in her multiplicity is an invitation to see our world, others, and ourselves in all our contradictions, and to hold one another with love and care. So in conclusion, the boundaries between monster and human are porous, and that is what makes Lilith and her other sister monsters so unsettling, and monsters in general. When we look at her closely and resist the urge to recoil, we see her multiplicity. She's tender and terrifying, sorrowful and sorrow-inducing, maternal and murderous. In acknowledging Lilith's multiplicity, we acknowledge our own and that of others. Lilith may be a monster, but she also asks us to look within ourselves and within Jewish tradition to engage with the parts of ourselves and our tradition that we find too monstrous to acknowledge. A rabbi may serve as a guide to this process, holding her congregants as they meet Lilith, enabling them to uncover her wisdom without being dragged into her depths. She makes sure they only come as close as it's safe to do so, and when the time comes to depart. So let us depart towards our period of questions.
So we do have time for questions, and the challenge to you is to make them actually questions this time, if we want to get more from there. I know.
That's actually quiet. It was brilliant. Just nodding at the back and cheering you on. Do you have anything to comment about Lilith and race? Is she an insider or an outsider to Jews? And if so, what does that do to her?
Oh, that's really exciting as a question. Thank you so much. I will wait for the microphone, as I've been told to do so. So you'll just have to wait. So I haven't read too much about Lilith and race, but I think it's a really interesting question. One thing that brought to mind was she's often associated with long, dark hair. So there's definitely sort of, she's on the dark side. And there's a lot of that kind of racially coded stuff about her. So while I haven't read anything, I can't imagine it's not there. And that would be a really interesting thing to look into.
The next one?
Y'all are speechless? Jews are never speechless. Come on.
Next.
You talk about if Lilith's monstrosity is murderous monstrosity is part of God's plan, then who's the real monster? Do you think that Lilith helps us to acknowledge God's monstrosity in the sense that if everything comes from God, that means terror and murder and infant death from God as well?
The short answer is yes. And I probably did write in my dissertation multiple times something to the effect of who is the real monster here. But I think it does reveal God's monstrosity. And I think we often feel pressure to sort of want to think that our God is all good. But actually, if you look at our texts, our God is actually usually an asshole. So I think that studying these texts gives us the freedom to be able to say that. And that makes our religious tradition no less valuable because, again, it's about being multiple. God is also a mother in labor. God is also a caring parent. God is also all these things. So yeah, I think it does. That's my monstrous mother.
I'm not saying anything else. No, I'm curious, number one, when were you first exposed to Lilith? And number two, what made you decide to do your dissertation on this?
So the first time I encountered Lilith was actually through a picture book that you bought me. But God Remembered, which was published mid-90s. And there's a very beautiful but sanitized version of this story. And it is sort of that reclamation of sort of about being about equality and demand for equality. But the reason why I got to this was actually because of the Material Girls podcast. So shout out to the Material Girls podcast if you're looking for something really interesting. They are two Canadian academics. I feel like I'm bringing a lot of Canada. Basically, they analyze popular culture using critical theory. So this was from a podcast where they were talking about goblin mode. They were talking about goblin mode in the object. Goblin mode, for those who are not initiated, is basically when you get really, really gross and comfortable in your house, like kind of we all were in COVID, and just like let your hair grow and enjoy being a gross goblin. And one of them also wrote a book that used the Monstrous feminine about Jurassic Park, and reading Jurassic Park as kind of a feminist classic, because all the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park are female monsters. So that's where I encountered those theories, and I thought, well, put them together, because actually for a long time it irritated me that this need to make Lilith nice and heroic, and actually villains are just as important as our heroes.
So we have a question on Zoom for Robin Asher, from Robin Asher and Steve. Hi, Robin.
Yeah.
If we can understand Zohar as monstrous, we also see the Torah as monstrous. Don't go there. Do you think that's generative and fantastic presentation and dissertation? It feels very urgent and necessary for the world today.
Thanks, Robin. And I should say Robin is one of my supervisors. The other supervisor was Tali, who you guys heard from earlier. So short answers, could we also say the Torah is monstrous? Yes. And do I think that that's generative? Also, yes. Because the way that we function as Jews is the way that we learn about ourselves, is how we engage with our text. The process of revelation is ongoing. And so to be able to see that everything, including our deities, deity, divine things, are also have that capacity to cause harm, helps us talk about that in humanity. And so that's why a lot of these really difficult stories are important, because our world is monstrous. The out there is monstrous, the in here is monstrous. And one of the ways that we've always worked through that as a people is to look at texts. And so the text too should be monstrous.
I mentioned to my mother that I was coming to this. She said, "Oh, we thought about calling you Lilith."
Sorry, what?
My mum said she thought about calling me Lilith.
Amazing.
But my question was that you brought out so many amazing and fascinating aspects of Lilith and multiplicity and everything, and one of them was that way in which she captures that like suppurating sort of fury. Has it led to any thoughts about, is the engagement with the text the ritual of catharsis? Or do you think, did it make you think about whether we need to find ways of kind of externalizing that, beyond that?
Such a good question. So I think that'll depend on the person in the community. And I think for a lot of people, text, especially for us as Jews, is very comfortable, even when the texts are not comfortable. It's something written down on a page that is concrete, and we can do analysis up here, even if it feels scary to go in here. But I think there is space for more embodied ritual. I'm thinking of, the practice of screaming into a pillow or throwing pillows across the room, and those can be really generative. But that's not going to be for everyone here. Texts are safe, and there's other things that can be safe too. But maybe not for people who would feel much safer with the text. There's a question on the computer also. Yeah.
Does Lilith as monster constitute an approach we should be exploring as a priestess pathway?
So just to jargon bust that, this is from Livia, my roommate from the co-ed Hebrew Priestess program. Glad you could be here. And the priestess pathways are basically different archetypes of how women and the divine feminine have shown up in Jewish tradition, and they're ways that we as women and femfolk can tap into leadership. I think that's a great question. I think I would say yes-ish. And I think why my answer is yes-ish is because I don't think we want to be Lilith, but I think we want to engage with Lilith. Shekhinah, the divine feminine, she who dwells amongst us, also a Kabbalistic concept. Lilith is her shadow side. And they're both associated with the sea. Shekhinah is called the Great Sea, and this calm, beautiful sea that receives everything. And Lilith has banished the sea, and she lives in the rough waters. And when you're sending her away in your sex ritual, you send her to the deep, traumatic waves that are blah, blah, blah. So they're kind of two sides of the same coin. So I would say it's less about having an additional priestess pathway or additional archetype, but about acknowledging that there are dark manifestations to every archetype, and using dark asterisk because it's really terrible and racist to say that everything dark is evil, but I can't find better words. So sorry.
So I'm going to ask a quick question. I'm going to go to Deborah.
Yeah, Sybil and Daniel.
Sybil and Daniel. And those will be the last two from the audience.
I was very struck by you talking, reminding me of Rebecca Hannah's use of enchantment and the way of sanitization that goes on with fairy tales as we tell them to children.
I'm very much aware of that now, so on to the third generation of how they become more and more anodyne. I'm just wondering, listening to you, and absolutely agreeing with you, that this sort of need for fear and terror is at what age? And how do we introduce, at what point do you throw Lilith in the organised sort of goriness at people, as opposed to, as you say, the really picture book that you received as a child?
It's a great question, and one that I've reflected on a lot because my dissertation almost was about how to teach difficult text to children. I think that's something I have to think about more, but I think my answer to at the moment would be in every age and stage, there's a right way of doing it. So I think quite a small child can understand, Lilith is very scary and she is, she might come and take you, and that could be really bad, but don't worry, she's not real. It's just to help us think about things that are scary. But with a teenager, you can start talking about the sex positions. Like it's so I think you just have to, and also each child is going to be different. And again, I'm shouting out my mom again because she's actually quite amazing at this. When we were like, I think, how old were we with the Dina was Yaakov's daughter? So when was it? When I was a kid, we would do these Dvar Torah plays for our family service, and she would write songs that would kind of try and get these complex ideas that are dark ideas to children. And we had Parashat Vayishlach, which has the rape of Dinah, and there was a song. Dinah was Yaakov's daughter, the only girl that he had. While wandering alone in the fields one day, she came across somebody bad. And so there was a way of bringing that to children. Like, okay, coming across somebody bad is something that we understand as children. But kind of going in traumatic rape is not necessarily as accessible, although sadly there are kids that age who do know about that. So it's very, very tricky, but I think it's an important question. But thanks for teaching me, Mom.
Thank you, that was a great presentation and amazing research. I'm reflecting on how one of the ways in which Lilith was engaged in for hundreds of years was in folk practices of amulets. So my question for you is, do you recommend that we have amulets? And if so, what should the text be? And maybe let's pretend no one else is listening, or you write me one, maybe, and all the same.
Amazing. So that is reaching into some stuff that hit the cutting room floor, unfortunately, because 20,000 words is 20,000 words, and I already went over the word limit. I think actually this presentation gave me a respect and fear for amulets that I didn't have before. I went to see a bunch of incantation bowls, which are demon traps that are at the British Museum. I did consider actually making amulets for this project. And I think developing that fear made me like, actually, these things are really powerful. And actually they're really scary. And I don't want to be frivolous about it. And when I taught at Moishe House, they wanted me to come and do some magic with them, some like anti-Lilith magic. And I was like, guys, we can't just do this as like a fun little activity, which is what you guys want. So I think, no, I wouldn't, but I can tell you a little bit about what would be on that amulet, which is it probably have Psalm 121. It would probably have, there are 3 angels. It might have the priestly blessing. It might have the names of the matriarchs and patriarchs. And I will show you a book of amulets, but I'm actually quite afraid and respectful of the magical traditions now. The closest thing I have, so shout out to one of my congregants who got me this necklace. It says, Matzala Manoach. She has found herself a resting place. And that is a reference to the one part of the Hebrew Bible in which Lilith is mentioned. And so I have decided I'm going to wear it every time I teach.
So one last quick question. Sounds flippant, but not meant to be. What would Lily want to you think? Generally, it's a serious question in the sense, part of our progressive tradition in this country is highly rationalist. And how has your experience been bringing these ideas into those parts of the British Jewish community where abjection isn't really much of a thing.
Love your questions. It's a good question, because I think that beyond what would Lily Montague say, as you say, there's a question beneath the question, which is how does this come to a very rationalist, very kind of head-focused intellectual culture, and what happens? And I think there are ways. I think there are many ways in which I am a disruption in the progressive rabbinic world, but I think that's true for a lot of my rabbinic student colleagues in a very, very positive way. But there are ways and ways. Like, I don't think that I would wander into quite a straight edge congregation and say, we're now all going to do a screaming ritual into a pillow to chase away Lilith, because I think everybody else would be chased away. But I come back to the idea of text being safe, even when the texts are not safe, because they're very grounding. And while this is not a purely intellectual exercise, as I mentioned, starting with it as an intellectual exercise can be the gateway towards having wider conversations, to having more embodied ritual, to doing all kinds of things like that. So Lily, I hope that you were not too disrupted by this, and you don't mind this happening in your library. And thank you, everybody.
Our last question, and then a last word. The foundational journal of Jewish feminism, that is 50 years old this year, is
Lilith
magazine. On their website, they have FAQs. Isn't Lilith a demon? And they tell the story of Lilith, but only the sexual part of the story. And then they say Jewish tradition and folklore characterize Lilith after her escape as a demon. But Lilith's founding mothers knew the truth. Even before Vashti, before Miriam and Ruth, she was the first feminist. How would you rewrite that for them?
Amazing, because that's exactly what I was addressed in this dissertation. I think what I would probably do, because I think it would be a very different magazine, actually, if it was what I would do. Like, I think maybe if it was what I would want to do, it'd have to be something like Chava Lilith, or something like Eve Lilith, or some kind of dual archetype, because I would rewrite that story, including both female characters, which actually is something that Judith Plaskow does, where she, like, one of the main reclamations is sort of Judith Plaskow writing about the relationship with Lilith and Eve and their sisterhood. And I think you could kind of tell the story of both of them. And in bringing in the multiplicity of the archetypes and showing how they are in conversation with each other, I think that would really add to it. I also did read for this paper Aviva Cantor's article about Lilith, which I think was in if not the first issue, then one of the first issues, where she compared the characters of Lilith and King David. And she basically said, well, King David is someone who has all kinds of crimes associated with him. And we basically focused on all the good stuff. And those are the stories we tell. And so why can't we do that with Lilith? Why can't we just say the good stuff about Lilith? And my challenge to her would be, well, why can't we say all the multiple stuff about both? Let's talk about King David's crimes, which I hope to do with you sometime.
Normally at this point in the proceedings, Rabbi Dr. Charles Middleborough, who's retiring at the end of this academic year, would stand up and say something to our soon-to-be colleague. In his absence, I am taking on that mantle just for this year. So first I want to say, Yashikar, it was a tremendous presentation. What a marvelous piece of work. It feels timely, it feels vital, it feels generative, to use your language, which is what you are. You are a person to dance with. You are a person to learn with. And many of you will know this, but basically for the past year, Yael's largely been in classes on her own. And last summer, I had a lot of faculty going, how will that be possible? How can I do that? And the answer is Yael makes that possible.
I talk for 10 students.
She makes it possible because she is a joy to teach. She is an intellectual partner for her teachers. She will be the most wonderful colleague, and we will miss her sorely at the college and hope that she will not be distant from us. So I want to thank you for today, but also to thank you for a really challenging 6 years that you've been around the college. Yael started during the global pandemic that some of you might recognize, remember, and has had her own special journey, unique journey to the rabbinate, including motherhood. And we will miss you sorely. So,
Can I give you a snuggle?
yeah. I'm going to invite all of us, I hope, when our helpers get back there, to have a glass of champagne, or Prosecco to be more exact, in the annex, definitely not in this room. I want to, while the Prosecco is being poured out, to take a moment to thank all of you for being here, those of you who've come specially for this, our people online, also those of you who've been here throughout the day for the LBC Study Day. If you want to know more about the college, if you've enjoyed this experience, if you want to do further study, that is what we are here for. Please come and talk to any of us who work and study here. We can give you advice about where you can access your Jewish learning through Leo Baeck College. I'm going to pay particular thanks to a few members of staff. Victor has been hiding in that cubbyhole back there. Come on out. Victor is our head of development, which means that if you feel so moved, he can take your money off of you and donations to the college, but he's also our technical wizard, and we are very grateful to him for making sure the tech worked throughout the day.
It's his.
And it's all his as well. I want to say thank you to Cassie Sacha, our senior librarian, who is back. A special thank you to our anonymous patron who made this space possible. We were so deeply worried about holding this study day on the hottest day of the year, and as you can see, although we're a bit schwitzy, nobody is passed out, and it is the most tremendous space, and we look forward to holding many more events like this in this space. So a great thanks to Cassie for helping hold that process of moving in here together, and to our donor for making that vision a reality. A thanks to Dr. Joanne Myers, who's in the back, who helped put together the events today. To Paolo Kulikowski and Valerie Kay, who did so much of the organization and to Nina and to Valerie's eldest, Joel, for being here, and so many things. And everybody who has done something today, to our wonderful students who produced that marvelous shachrit for us, to Tali, to Sarah Rubina, to Dr. Keith Khan Harris for presenting to us. And I look forward to raising a glass of Prosecco with all of you.